Well, thank you for coming, and it's great to see you all. And yes, I'm sort of wondering now why I agreed to do something at this time of the weekend, because I'm feeling quite tired. But we'll see how we go. I was just looking in the conference brochure, and I noticed that I wasn't sure, but for some reason Kevin put me under the heading of nurture, I think it was. And I thought, well, that's quite strange. But coming to this point, I think that's rather nice. So we're going to do something kind of nurturing, in one way or another.
Could you turn up the mic?
Turn up the mic. I don't have control over that. Can you not hear? Maybe I'm not near enough to this thing.
It's not too bad.
It's right window. It's not my window.
It's kind of.
It's kind of.
I think I'm sure we'll be alright.
Okay, it's probably because I asked for it not to be in the middle of my throat because it was feeling a bit odd.
Is that any better?
Is that any better?
Yes. I think it probably is. Just enough. Thank you.
Okay.
Probably go a bit further.
So it would be really interesting for me to know if many of you went to Stephen's talk this morning. Great, so it's kind of half and half, isn't it? That's interesting. I sort of stepped in and out because, as you probably know, I'm kind of also being a market trader this weekend, so I have to sort of have these different hats for when I'm teaching and when I'm selling. But I've known Stephen for a really long time, and I must say he's someone who's I've respected greatly, and kind of agree with most of what I heard this morning. There are certain things, and I can say this because I know he's gone now, and we had a nice conversation before he went. And you'll find this with anyone who works with Chinese text, that they'll say, yes, but that's not quite right. And probably one thing that I felt was that I love his breadth of scholarship. And he's a fantastic person for contrasting and comparing and letting you see the whole breadth of something in a way that's really, really important. When it came to his translation and understanding of the classical text, I found it slightly lacking. And I would say it was sort of lacking, and I'm going to call it nourishment because that's what our title is. And it was slightly lacking in what I would consider to be a depth of understanding, which of course he was racing through and he didn't have much time. So what I want to try and do with the very short time we've got together, and I'm used to talking about this subject for either a day or a weekend, so we can only glide over the surface really. But almost in addition to what you've had from Stephen, because normally when I teach I like to give a bit of that historical overview, but I'm not going to do any of that because even those of you who didn't hear him, you can probably catch up with all of that online or something. But I just want to try and give you a slight flavour of what I feel has really nurtured my practice from these classical texts, because it's a different thing. I'm not an academic scholar, and I'm not sort of comparing and contrasting. I'm much more interested in sort of finding things that speak to me and finding things that I find inform my practice and the way I work. So we're all sort of looking for different things, and I would say the interesting thing for me about this subject of the 8 extraordinary meridians, or the Jijing Ba Mai, is that it's always completely fascinated me. And still, it's probably I wouldn't say it was probably my favourite thing. I'm very fascinated by them. And when I first studied acupuncture, I can remember learning in my first week or so some points and being told that this was the master point of this extraordinary meridian. And I immediately wanted to know what that meant and went off and did some research and tried to find out what these things were. The interesting thing for me as well, and particularly those of you who were listening to Stephen, he was talking about how Li Shizhen, who was the very famous 16th century physician who wrote the first exposition on the 8 extraordinary channels as a complete work, you could say, talked about it very much in the way of it being a practice of the sage and a practice for meditation and for in alchemical practices and qigong type practice as much as herbs and acupuncture. So my first, you could say the first time I came in contact with these meridians was when, as a very young student in Japan, I was with a teacher and he worked a lot with people with mental disturbance. And Stephen mentioned that Li Shizhen, and I didn't know this, I was really pleased to hear Stephen saying this morning, that Li Shizhen in the 16th century talked about regulating the renmai and the dumai by doing a meditation circulation of light practice, which is exactly what my teacher in Japan gave to his mentally ill students, and what was my first time I heard about these channels, you could say, was in that context. So, and he saw this as regulating yin and yang, that the simplest, most direct way in which we can regulate the yin and the yang in the body, and particularly for someone who isn't really able to do a lot, is in a bit of a state, this kind of practice, which was done daily, and it was done with other things, and it was done with some acupuncture and other things, no doubt, but their main practice was to do this very gentle circulation of light, which he said balanced the yin and yang, and he said balanced the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system to create a balance in the brain. So that has always fascinated me. And I went on to, you could say that during my study at college I was kind of rather frustrated by the fact that I couldn't really find as much as I wanted to about these channels. And then it was when I began to study with Claude Law and Elizabeth Rochard, and we did one of our early seminars of our group that sort of gathered together in London around that time. One of our early seminars was on the 8 extraordinary channels, and to me it was the 8 extraordinary channels from the Neijing and from the Nanjing, from the two early texts, and it completely opened my eyes to what these things were and informed my practice as to how I could use them. So for me, the study of the classics in that way has never been a theoretical thing. It's always been something that I feel speaks to me and absolutely informs my understanding of what I do and why I do what I do. So these extraordinary channels, and the qi of the Qijing Bamai means extraordinary, surprising, unusual. And the unusualness is again partly something that Stephen touched on, which is to do with the fact they're not in the main 12 channels. There's something other than that. There's something different. There's something apart from that. And they're not in that 5-element yin-yang system of paired channels, yin-yang pairs. There's something other than that. And what I want to do with the time we've got today is to just go through one of the clearest, simplest texts on the 8 extraordinary channels, which is the Nanjing chapter 28, which gives a very short description of them, and it also talks about a particular point with each of them. So I wanted to just use that as a way into talking about these channels and how they are used. So again, if there's any questions as we go along, I'm quite happy if you just want to put your hand up, or we can do that. So we don't have a lot of time. Luckily we have a clock, so I can try and keep to time. But I just wanted to take you through that channel, through that text, and also at the end we'll just have a summary and talk a little bit about certain points that are connected and how they might be used.
Was the Japanese teacher Motoyama?
Yeah. Who actually died last weekend. Thank you. Sorry, I'm not used to PCs, and I always get a bit strained with PCs. This is a quote from the Nanjing Difficulty 23, which says, "The 8 extraordinary meridians ensure the regulation and the first laws for the relationship and circulation of blood and qi, essences and qi, yin and yang." And it's this idea of this circulation being at a very basic basic level. Another thing that Stephen mentioned was that they're not concerned with the 5 elements. It's almost like, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about something else that Stephen brought up, which was to do with the fact that when we take our first breath and when we eat our first food is when the 12 channels really come to take over the circulation. Before that, there's this very deep inner regulation, which we sometimes call the embryological circulation. And certainly in a lot of Taoist texts, there's a referral to this embryological circulation that happens. So there's the idea that beneath and underneath this sort of meridian system of the 12 that we're very used to dealing with, there's this deeper functioning that goes on with the 8. And this is from the Survey of Chinese Medicine, which is a very early book by Claude Lar and Elizabeth Rochard, which says the 8 extraordinary meridians represent the first organized circuitry of the energetic field. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. These are just a couple of ideas to sort of think about as we go along, really. And this is Elizabeth Rochard from her book, The 8 Extraordinary Meridians, which says, when the 12 meridians are unable to cope with the extraordinary circumstances of life, we need to turn to this more ancient and deeper regulation. This is the character for Du of Du Mai, usually translated as governor, and it's a reasonably good translation of the Chinese. It means someone who's looking out over something on behalf of the emperor. It's the idea that they have a kind of mandate to look after a territory almost. And there's something in the character that suggests that it's of the family of the emperor. So it's related to the emperor, and it's someone who's looking out over a whole territory on behalf of the emperor. So it's someone who's governing a territory. And in the text of Nanjing Difficulty 28, there's a very, very clear description of each of them, very simple, and very interestingly different from some of the texts in the Su Wen, which are quite complex. And the Nanjing is usually called difficult issues, whereas the Su Wen is simple questions. And the Nanjing is often questions that have arisen from looking at the Neijing, and so the Nanjing discusses what are considered to be the difficult issues found within the Neijing, the Su Wen, and the Ling Xun. So this chapter is almost like a little summary of what you find in the Neijing. And in the Neijing, the descriptions of these channels tend to be rather scattered about. There's a lot in Su Wen chapter 60, which has quite long descriptions. It's almost like they've been compressed and compacted into this chapter here to give the essence of what these meridians are about. So it says that Du Mai arises from the U of the lower ridgepole. And this is an interesting term, the lower ridgepole. The G is the G of what we call the Tai Chi. And the idea of there being a kind of pole at this point is quite an interesting thing to keep in mind. Because it's almost as if we have this energetic circuitry that was talked about in the last quote, which is sort of stretching between these two poles. We've got a lower pole and an upper pole, which start to create a movement in this circuitry. It starts from the U of the lower ridge pole. It doubles the spinal column on the inside. It raises to Feng Fu and penetrates the brain, with which it takes a belonging relationship. Sorry, I've realised that when I turn away from this, this is when this goes away. Is it okay at the back? Can you hear? I probably should stand the other side. A few very interesting things in here, because we have the point Feng Fu, which, as we know, is the point at the back of the nape of the neck, in which qi is able to enter into the brain. And the characters they use for the brain with which it takes a belonging relationship are exactly the same as the descriptions of the channels. That the stomach channel takes a belonging relationship with the stomach. That the spleen channel takes a belonging relationship with the spleen. So exactly that same character is used here, pretty much suggesting that, I'm just going to move this out of the way, that it's almost like the brain is the organ of the Dumai almost. That's almost what this text suggests here. And the idea that through the spinal column, the Dumai is able to raise the clear yang energy up into the brain. The brain is a sea of marrow. It's usually called the sea of marrow. And it's a very dense yin substance. And it has to be enlightened by the qi. And the Dumai, as the kind of ocean or the sea or the conduit of the yang qi, the main yang qi, the sort of governor of the yang qi of the body, is able to make that yang energy rise up and to penetrate the brain. And literally, and the word in Chinese would be used in many different ways, it enlightens. So it's able to lighten up the brain in terms of it allows the eyes to see, the ears to hear, the mouth to taste. It gives us the facility to be able to use our brain in a dynamic way. And it has a particular interesting relationship often with all the activities of the orifices, the upper orifices. And, we could talk a long time about the way it moves up the back and the way the different points at the names on the back channel sort of describe this movement up the back. And the point Du16 at the nape of the neck is considered in sort of more Taoist alchemy texts as a gateway. It's the third gateway in the spine, where the yang is able to, the qi is able to penetrate to the brain. And sorry, I'm not moving. Oh, here you are. This is just a very typical alchemical picture, which I'm sure you've seen, which sort of just shows this idea of the qi moving up the spine in a pictorial way. Very well-known pictures. And my great friend Peter Firebrace, who I'm sure lots of you know, just recently made a trip to Beijing where he went to the White Cloud Temple to do some translations of some of these maps, which is a really nice, exciting project that he's going to be getting into. Well, I want to quickly move on to the idea of the renmai, because what I want to do is quickly to sort of contrast and compare these channels and see how different they are in their function. The character for renmai, on this side we've just literally got a human being. On this side, it's literally a picture of anyone who's spent time in the Far East will be, well, probably not so much recently, but certainly when I was spending time in the Far East, people were still carrying loads on a bamboo pole. And it means to carry a burden, to carry something. So it's kind of to do with human endurance in the old descriptions of the character. So when we translate the renmai as the conception vessel, it's not a great translation. It's one of the possibilities, and it's sort of a little bit of a far-fetch, because really if you put the character for a woman in place of the human being, you would have one of the characters for pregnancy, a pregnant woman. But in this context, just with the human being character, it's about the ability to carry, to nurture, to sustain something. So whereas the yang aspect of the Dumai was more about this ability to raise the yang and to take care of the yang, in its character, the renmai has a lot more to do with this ability to hold and to carry and to nourish. And certainly, because of that ability to hold and to carry and to nourish, it's absolutely related to conception but it's not, conception is not a good translation for Renmai. And the same chapter has, again, a similar description of the Renmai. Renmai arises below the middle summit, so we've got the middle summit here, the Zongji, arises to the border of the pubic hair, passes along the abdomen on the inside, and rises to Guan Yuan, Ren 4. It reaches the throat, the larynx and the pharynx. Again, it's the mention of this point, Ren 4. For Dumai, we had the point at the back of the nape of the neck, bringing the clarity into the brain. Here, we've got the point that's called the gateway into the origin. So here, we've got a gateway going into the brain. Here, we've got a gateway going into the inner aspect of the belly. And of course, Ren 4 is very much related to the uterus as well. So 2 different kinds of gates, 2 different kinds of accesses into the interior with those 2 points. One very much nourishing the yin, one taking the yang into the brain. If we move on to Chongmai, Chong has the idea of something very strong, very pressing, very urgent, very, very powerful. This character here, split on both sides, is the character Xing, which is to move. It's the Xing of the wuxing, the 5 phases, elements, movements. And it means to move. And it means to move in a particularly regulated way. And inside that, there's the idea of something very strong and very powerful, with also the idea etymologically of something that's kind of building up. It's kind of almost like building up a pressure and then it's moving. So within the Chong, there's always this idea of this bursting. You know, it's seen in points that are considered to be really strong and moving. So here we've got the same text on the Chongmai. The Chongmai arises at Chi Chong, at stomach 30. It doubles the pathway of the Yang Ming of the foot, the stomach meridian. It surrounds the navel and rises. It meets the middle of the thorax and it diffuses there. And this is interesting because this is probably the one case in which the text of the Nanjing differs quite strongly with the text of the Neijing. And I'm just going to show you, so I'm not going to do it for most of them, but I just want to show you this interest because it's interesting. Almost exactly the same text. Chongmai arises at Chi Chong, stomach 30. It doubles the pathway of the Shaoyin of the foot, the kidney meridian. It surrounds the navel and it rises. It reaches the middle of the thorax and it diffuses there. So one of the texts has the pathway following the stomach channel. One of them, the earlier text, has the pathway following the kidney channel. And I find this really quite fascinating because it's interesting because you can, I was thinking about this when I was listening to Stephen earlier on today, that when you see differences in different texts, you can either see it as, well, they said one thing and they said another thing, so you know, how do we know that? What do we do? Whereas I think it's much more interesting to sort of say, well, why might some person be saying that and why might they be saying that and what can we find that unites these two things, or why might they be saying a different thing in a different context? And the interesting thing when you've got the Dumai and the Renmai, which we could say emerging from this lower point are coming up in this kind of a way. And we've got the Chongmai, which is considered to surge between them. And it's usually seen as being that we've got the yin and the yang in a kind of dynamic balance with the Dumai and the Renmai. This circuitry is the basic balancing of yin and yang. We've got the point here, which is the belly and the yin, all the yin aspects of that. We've got the point here, which is, we've got Du 16 and we've got Ren 4, which are these very sort of dynamic yin-yang balancing points almost in our channel circuitry. And then between these two, we suddenly have this surging, which is a mixture of yin and yang. It's like Chongmai is usually seen as, it's got yin aspect, it's got yang aspects, it's got a mixture of them both. And some of the diagrams that I really like are kind of seen as it's spiraling. Chongmai has this sort of spiraling action. And this is actually the way it's described in some of the more Taoist meditational texts, that Chongmai is felt to have this spiraling action up the centre of the body. It's always balancing yin and yang. It's always got this dual thing of balancing blood and qi. It balances, some of its descriptions are of a sea of blood, others are of a sea of qi. It's always got these two different aspects, so it's kind of balancing. And it's also interesting that in terms of being described as being of the kidney meridian and being described as the stomach meridian in the later text, it's sometimes described by commentators as it being a kind of balancer between what we might call pre-heaven and post-heaven. It's a balancer between the energies that come from the sort of origin of pre-heaven, and then as soon as we get the stomach, it's almost like, okay, here we are, this is post-heaven. It's to do with food and nourishment and creating form and matter in a different kind of a way. So we've got both of those dynamics with the Chongmai. And it seems that it's always important to remember that when working with it, that you have both its aspect of a sea of blood, but it's also the sea of the 12 meridians. And so it's always got this kind of interesting yin-yang dynamic with it. There are other texts which we don't have much time to really go into, but there's some other texts it's all in the Su Wen actually, in the early texts of the Su Wen, which also describe this channel which surges from stomach 30 into the legs. So you've got this dynamic movement from this point Chi Chong down into the legs. And those of you who were listening to Stephen, he sort of talked a little bit at the end. I wasn't able to stay to the end of the talk, but he began to talk about some of his speculations about sort of embryological development. And I have a good friend who's an acupuncturist and an osteopath, some of you might have heard of, called Phil Beach. And he's done quite extensive research into embryology, as a lot of osteopaths do, actually. And we made together some rather interesting suggestions on what happens with this Chongmai, and if there is something happening embryologically with this sort of the way the fetus is developing, that maybe Chongmai is this surge of energy into the limbs, which I quite like the idea of that. And there's a certain stage in embryological development where this particular group of tissues, which forms, it's sort of around the edge of the body, forming a kind of lateral ring. It's a particular kind of tissue that's there for quite a short amount of time, but it's through that tissue that the limbs emerge. And that tissue, that particular embryological tissue, ends up being on the tips of the fingers and the tips of the toes and on the genitals. And in the development of the embryology, it forms forward. And when the midline is created in the front of the body, it forms the mouth. So there's some really interesting relationships with embryological development and these actual pathways. It's also, this particular tissue ends up being on the nipple line of the body, which again is a very close relationship with where we tend to think of as Chong Mai. An area for more research, which would be fantastic to do one day. So if I had another life, I think I'd be an embryologist as well and try and do some of that. But there's some quite possibilities for interesting research. Of course, it's always difficult doing embryological research, but they're photographing the development of the embryo at very early stages now, and we might learn some very interesting things, not just with the extraordinary meridians, but the way tissues migrate in the body is beginning to be possibly understood as why some of the bizarre connections we have in Chinese medicine between points and meridians and effects, and because there are similar tissues involved, and similar tissues that evolved at the same time, developed at the same time, and have an inner sort of connection still out to the surface. So some very interesting possible research. I wish there was more research into that kind of thing. It would be really nice. So with the first three, we have this idea of the yin in the front, the yang in the back, and this kind of mixture of the two possibly moving up in the center, spreading out into the chest, and then with this dynamic movement down into the legs. And just while we're talking about that again, we know that the point stomach 30 is really used a lot for helping any kind of paralysis or numbness or difficulty in walking, because it takes qi into the legs, and it's one of the major points for doing that. So I always think of that with this surge of Chong Mai taking the energy down into the legs. The fourth channel, the Dai Mai, and they're usually described in this order, quite a strict order is given. If the 12 are all mentioned, it's always in this order. And the character for Dai Mai is a very simple one compared to the others in a way. This at the top is simply the sort of gathering together of clothes under a belt. And I often use this example, but because I spent several years living in Japan, I used to teach English to various students, and they always really liked dressing me up in a kimono, and which is a very interesting thing to do. And kimonos are really extraordinary because they're just one size. It's like you don't have sizes in kimono, they're just all one size. So depending on how tall or short or fat or thin you are, you have to arrange it all under this incredibly complex thing of belts around here. And you sort of put something on, and then you put one belt on, and you put something else on, and another belt, and then you hitch it up, and then you end up with about 6 belts. 6 layers of belts, and you can't move at all. And if it's too tight, you can't breathe. And if it's too loose, the kimono is just going to drop away. You know, you're going to kind of end up with it trailing behind here. So the tension of those belts is absolutely vital to stop your kimono falling down, basically, or to stop you asphyxiating. And this is almost exactly this character, except we've also got something dangling here from the belt. And the Dai Mai is about the right tension, the right lateral tension in the body. If it's too loose, things will fall away. And I don't know why I'm causing that, probably too close to that.
You need to just knock the little red dial that's a fraction down.
At this one?
The red one, bottom right. Just a extension. Where was I?
as I'm sure we all know, some of the main pathologies for daimai are discharges. It's like Dai Sha is the name of a discharge. It's the Chinese for the discharge. It's the same character. It just means this going down. Sha is the character to go down. So if this is going down, you get discharges, you get hernias, you get prolapses. So if your daimai isn't holding things really well in this lateral aspect, you're going to get sort of, leukorrhea is always the thing that's given as the main thing, but you're just going to have things falling away, prolapses, all that kind of thing. And it's described in quite a few texts, and again, Stephen mentioned this morning that there were sort of a few points given, but it's actually, the very interesting thing is that in the Suwen text, it's described as having a relationship with the kidneys, with bladder, particularly the name of bladder 23 is used. So it begins around that area in the back, around the area of Mingmen, and comes forward and goes down towards Renmai 4. It has this moving down. And of course, the point which I can't show you because we're on a funny angle, but the point that's usually mentioned is the point daimai, which is gallbladder 26, which has all of those indications of the tightening and the loosening and the allowing things to move down or kept up to keep them in place, which is exactly at the side of the waist. The description in Nanjing 28 is incredibly simple. Daimai arises from the last ribs, it turns once around the body. It couldn't be simpler. In the Neijing, there are slightly more complex, but not much. It's seen as a belt that goes round. Certainly in some of the Neijing texts, the point bladder 23 is mentioned, and it's said to have some kind of internal relationship with the kidneys. But it's really interesting that you've got this channel that's suddenly giving us this sort of lateral extension. So we sort of had a back and a front, and now we've got this sort of dimensional lateral extension of a channel going round. Sort of like that. Did you all get some kind of handout? Did that happen?
No.
No, I asked if they were printing them, and they said no, they weren't printing them this year, but they were giving them to everyone online. But I sort of doubted that somehow. No, okay. Because most of these are in a handout, and I've got a few copies, but I can, anyone who wants this on a handout, I can email it to you if that would be. I've got most of these quotes on the handout, so I can email it to you. This is Li Shizhen, who, and I can't, for those of you who listened to Stephen this morning, will know all about Li Shizhen, but those of you who weren't with Stephen this morning, Li Shizhen is a 16th century physician, very famous, mostly famous as a herbalist, really. And interestingly, gave a lot of herbal prescriptions specifically for the 8 extraordinary channels. And he, as I said originally, wrote this first real exposition on the 8 extraordinary channels. He's always quoting earlier doctors, and he said, this is Li Shizhen quoting Yang Shi, who was, I'm not quite sure who he was, I think he was a couple of centuries earlier. He said that daimai takes all the mai under its command by linking them. It ensures that there is no erratic circulation, like a man who ties together a belt which hangs at the front, hence its name. Very simple. So in a way, the daimai is possibly the easiest of these channels to understand, but always remembering this idea of the tension. Not too tight, not too loose. is another little quote from the Survey of Chinese Medicine, which is a very, very early book by Claude Lara and Elizabeth Rochard. They did with a French doctor called Jean Schatz. And I think it's still in print, actually. It goes in and out of print, but it's printed in the US. I think it's still around, but it's got some nice, very, very nice things in it. And in there they mention Chongmai, Renmai, Dumai and Daimai form the first embryological structure, or the first generation of the extraordinary meridians. So they, at that time, and this was written in the early 70s, they certainly also had that idea that Stephen again touched on a bit later, that there was this idea of this association with embryological development and these extraordinary channels. So the first generation, it's almost like they're setting the boundaries, they're setting the mark, they're setting the first solid structure. That's actually a picture from that book, which is just quite a simple, and as you all know, Mai and Mo. Mo was a kind of earlier version of a romanization of what we now tend to call the Mai. I quite like this feeling of it here. Some very interesting discussions in the chapter of the Su Wen, which is about Wei syndrome, which is the sort of wilting syndrome, you could say, also can be sometimes translated as impotence. And the fact that Daimai and Chongmai have a very important relationship to this whole muscular structure that's in the perineum. And this idea of the holding up and the keeping things in their right place in that lower abdominal perineum area. These first 4 channels, it's almost like they have a central thing going on there, where the Du, the Ren and the Chong can rise up from this area. And then the Daimai gives that its proper sort of tension in a way. But always considered to be extremely important in any kind of flaccidity of the musculature. We'll talk about that a bit more later on. Any questions before we go on a little bit with the next 4?
Sorry, may I ask a question?
Yes, yes.
Can I ask the gentleman sitting nearest that microphone to make a point of view again? Right in the front there, or perhaps you could.
This one, it fell over.
Yeah. Lovely.
Okay, so up till now, we've had these 4 different channels. Certainly, the first 2 were very much related to the yin and the yang, and the sort of independently taking care of the yin and the yang, as it were. The next 2, the Dai and the Chong, really working more on the balance of all of that. And here we come into our sort of pairs, the Chao and the Wei Mai, which are usually seen in the yin and yang pairing, particularly with the yin and yang Chao. The character Chao means to stand up straight and to extend. And it's very often associated with the idea of literally being able to stand up, being able to walk, being able to move, being able to almost have that balance to be able to stand up straight and walk. So the same text, the Nanjing Difficulty 28. Again, a very short, concise little sentence. The Yang Chao Mai arises from the middle of the heel. It passes over the external malleolus and penetrates Feng Qi, gallbladder 20. I'm going to do the yin and the yang together, actually, because it's quite nice to see. The yin chao mai arises from the middle of the heel. It passes over the internal malleolus and it rises. It reaches the pharynx, it crosses and then joins chong mai. So we have these two channels that are arising at the same point. A little bit similar to the Du and the Ren arising from the same point in the perineum. The Yin and the Yang Chao Mai arise together in the middle of the heel. Some of the modern books sort of almost make an assumption that they are rooted in kidney 6 and bladder 62, but they're actually, they're together at their starting point. So in the same way that the yin and the ren mai and the du mai are pooled energy together and they divide into yin and yang, it's a little bit the same here. And this is the first channel, of course, that's coming from the feet and it's going upwards in the body. It's also one of the few instances where what we now can call the master and couple points of these channels are mentioned specifically in the classical text. Another thing that any of you who listened to Stephen earlier on would know is that the actual pairings of these meridians and the assignment of master and couple points came quite late on. It wasn't really clarified until the 14th, 15th century. So what do these channels do? Right, just trying to, let's go back to that. We probably all are very familiar with the most commonly discussed pathology of these channels, which is insomnia and somnolence, sleepiness. And their regulation is, in that way, is almost seen to be a regulation between night and day, between the opening and the closing of the eyes. The ability of the yang to ascend and the yin to ascend, the sort of succession of the yin and yang ascending and descending in the body that enables the eyes to open and for us to be awake, and then enables the eyes to close and for us to become more internal. So it's almost like, on one level, it's the sort of circulation of the energy being more yang in the day and then more yin at night. You could say that that's part of this yin-yang balance. The yin and yang Chao Mai have an incredibly complex, and you can see lots of different texts referring to different things that they do, and it's always about the balancing of yin and yang. Sometimes very specifically, sometimes in these sort of cycles of sleeping and waking, and as we know, they also meet each other at bladder 1. And the very common treatments for example, insomnia, are needling the 2 points on the ankle and also bladder 1. And it's something that is fantastically good for all kinds of times when those cycles of day and night have gone out of balance, like kind of having jet lag or being someone who's worked nights, or that kind of thing. When you're sleeping, your regulation of your inner patterning has kind of gone off whack a bit. So from those very sort of large cycles of the yin and the yang, in the daily thing, we've also got quite strong descriptions of the left and the right side of the body, or the left and the right side of the limb, so that you'll possibly have one side of the body that's one side of a limb, for example. This is the example that's quite often given, where the musculature is too strong on one side and too flaccid on the other. That's again a very common type of pathology that's seen for the Chow Mai. So they're often said to sort of govern the way the energy is regulated up and down and left and right. And similarly to the Ren Mai and the Du Mai, they have a circle, they have a circuit. So in the same way that we've got this circuit here, where we've got the Ren and the Du Mai being together in the perineum and then dividing and coming together again at the mouth. With the yin and the yang Chow Mai, they're together in the heel and then they meet together in the eyes. And whereas, again, in some of the Taoist alchemical texts, this is described as the microcosmic orbit of the breathing, there are also certain Qigong exercises which use the heels and the eyes as that same kind of circuit, as it were. And it's often called the macrocosmic circuit. The idea in both of those, just very basically balancing yin and yang in the whole body system. And again, these channels are for very, very, very basic balancing of yin and yang. It's like it's before we get into the complexity of the organs and the different channels and the pathologies of the different organs. It's right at the basis of a kind of imbalance in the actual deep formation of yin and yang not working together very well. I think one of the things that I kind of come across quite a lot, sometimes a confusion between yin and yang Chow and yin and yang Wei and the differences and how would they be used. And I think the most important thing to remember is that the yin and yang Chow, as we've just said, have this circuit. They're constantly balancing each other. The yin and the yang Wei are completely different to that. I'm sure there must be cases when you might, but I personally don't think I've ever used them together. They're not two channels I would consider sort of using together in one treatment. It would be quite unusual. It's possible, I'm not saying it's not possible, but it's not something I would do a lot of. Whereas nearly always I would be working with the yin and the yang Chow together to make a balance. The character Wei, again, is a really, really interesting one. And this radical here is the silk thread. It's seen in a lot of the characters that are used to describe channels, because it's like a thread-like continuation, a continuity of something. The other part of the character, which is the phonetic, kind of possibly a little bit more difficult to explain and describe, but it has a really interesting etymology in that the actual character is a kind of bird, and it's a bird that has a particular structure of feathering. And that same character is used to describe the way things interlink and overlap. For example, the same character is used with a different radical for a bunch of bananas. And the bunch of bananas is quite a nice sort of image in a way, because there's this sort of central stalk with these overlapping things hanging off it, so that things are kind of, it's like a sort of suit of armour that's all overlapping. And the character way is about sort of gathering something together. It's about creating a protection. Creating a kind of enveloping network is the way it's often described. But it's also very clear that the Yang Wei Mai has responsibility for enveloping and protecting the Yang. The Yin Wei Mai has the capacity to protect the Yin. So unlike the Chow Mai, they're not balancing each other. They have a different function in that each one is responsible for their own thing, as it were. Their pathologies are very different. So with the Chow Mai, the pathologies are always seen as an imbalance between the two. With the Wei Mai, Yin Wei Mai pathology is quite specific, Yang Wei Mai pathology is quite specific. Yang Wei Mai always connected with the defense and the defensive qi. The Yin Wei Mai always connected with the nutrition and the nutritive qi. So the yin and the wei qi. A different way, different character way. So we can somehow see these as, whereas the Chow Mai were to do with this sort of up and down and movement and cycles and rhythms, as it were. Rhythm is a really good word for the Chow Mai. They sort of keep the rhythm of things going. The Wei Mai are quite different in that they're more about nutrition and defense. And whereas we saw this sort of movement up and down, we're now seeing a sort of movement, the yin movement, which is a gathering towards the inner, and the yang movement, which is a protection towards the outer. There's always that dual movement with these two, of an inside movement and an outside movement. So the yang way, the defense on the exterior, the yin way with the nurturing the interior. And really interesting, the choice of points that was kind of eventually made. Again, these 2 points are not, as I said, they're not described as kind of what we now call master couple points until much later on. But certainly these 2 points, the inner gate and the outer gate, which are the master points for Yin and Yang Wei Mai, are talked about in the early texts. They're not called, the term master and couple didn't come till much later, but they're mentioned in terms that, of course, triple heater 5 is a kind of outer gate. It's stopping anything coming in. So it's a really fantastic choice of a point to say this is about the defense of the exterior. And the Yin Wei Mai, pericardium 6, with its link between the nutritional aspects of the spleen and stomach and the nurturing aspects of the heart. It's almost like that point is about a kind of communion between those two things. And very much a nourishing of the inner. And it's interesting that in all of these channels, it's only the Yin Wei Mai that has, it's interesting because the pathology is sometimes called pain in the heart, different kinds of pain in the heart, but it could most certainly be described as emotional pain. So, and I think it's possibly more likely, we don't know because the Chinese use the word heart-mind, it's the same thing. But the implications or the suggestions is that this channel is very much to do with an emotional aspect of the being as much as the nutritional. Fantastic channel, for example, again, a sort of, it's always quite nice to just think of a very obvious example, but things like eating disorders where you feel that someone is sort of unable to nourish themselves. And Yin Wei Mai would many times be my treatment of choice for someone with anorexia, or that kind of inability to nourish both on a psychological and physical level. Because the other thing it's always important to remember is that within the Chinese text there is really no distinction between what's physical and what's emotional. There's no distinction between what we might call spiritual and what we might call physical. It's just a matter of clarity, and it's just a matter of things functioning well in order for these more refined aspects of the being to work well. So there would be no distinction between whether you're on what level one is nourishing oneself, because it's the same thing. If you're nourishing one aspect, you're nourishing the other. And if you're not able to nourish yourself in a particular way, it shows both a physical and a psychological possible. It's interesting that in this text of Nanjing Difficulty 28, there's not a pathway given for the Yin and Yang Wei Mai at all. And it's almost like I've given up thinking of them as pathways. I tend to think of them as these functions of the sort of gathering together and having the fastening and holding the body together, this term Wei Lo. This is the low of the low channels, and this combination is a really lovely description of this sort of gathering together and binding. The low is often used as a word to sort of bind things together. So again, it was kind of later that, and again, not until probably the 16th century with Li Shizhen, that these Yin and Yang Wei Mai were given the sort of precise points and channels as we tend to know them today. These are just some quite interesting old diagrams, which some of them sort of showing the pathways that were described by Li Shizhen in his later. And this one is a bit later on again. This one, a terrible copy, and can't read it anyway, but it's showing this beginning in Kidney 9, which in the sort of later text, Kidney 9 is a point that's mentioned in association with the Yin Wei Mai from an early text, and sometimes it's given as the starting point. Li Shizhen talks about Kidney 9 as often being the starting point. Other texts talk about it as being even further down on the foot. So there's quite a few different ideas about where these channels are. And I think rather than being disturbed by that, which is a possibility, a possible reaction to the fact that they've been described differently over time, I kind of tend to see it more as a suggestion that they're very vague. You know, they're not precise. They're not precise in the same way that the 12 are precise. They're not, we can't give them such an obvious sort of route along the body, and we probably give the main channels too obvious a route sometimes as well. But these channels are much more vague. They're described in much more vague ways, and it's almost like the parts of the body that they influence are suggested more by these lists of points rather than an actual sort of line on the body necessarily. We kind of joined up the dots, as it were, but we need to have a kind of slightly broader understanding. but very interesting as well that 3 of these yin channels meet at Ren 22. Again, a very difficult kind of, it's always difficult to try and show 3 dimensions in 2-dimensional form, but the idea of this diagram here is to show that this yang wei is coming towards the outside, the chong wei is going towards the inside, which that certainly doesn't really convey. And we've got the yang chao and the yin chao doing a kind of up and down, almost sort of enlarging the scope of the Ren and the Du and taking it out to a more all-body physical level, as it were. This is a quote I really like, which does come from one of Stephen's books from his teacher Yoshio Manaka. And it's this idea, as he says, the ancient Chinese were concerned with reinstating the prenatal symmetry that we lose through our development. And we have, with these 8 channels, the idea of a very kind of primitive organization of yin and yang that control the way the energy moves up and down, from the front and the back, to the left and the right, to the inside and to the outside, the way it's controlled by the daimai so that it's not stopped in that way, that it's able to flow up and down and around in the proper manner. And one of the things that Stephen mentioned in his talk, which was quite interesting to me, and again, it's talked about quite a bit in the early book by Claude and Elizabeth that I mentioned, The Survey, that these channels are totally in play during embryological development. They're laying down this sort of first, more primitive structure to the body and to the meridian system. They're possibly controlling the way that the embryo develops in terms of its sort of constant folding and folding around and refolding and until we become the sort of body that we eventually are. And until there is the first intake of breath and the lungs begin to function, and until there is the first food so that the stomach and spleen begin to function, we kind of have this inner regulation that's just keeping things going. It's not having to do very much, apart from it's taking its food from an external source and things are kind of being done for it. So it's a body in preparation. And it's not until with the breath and with the food that we actually start to be an independent being, and then it's considered that the 12 meridians totally come into being and take over. And there's also some people would say, okay, then do the 8 extraordinary meridians stop functioning after birth? It seems that's a possibility, we don't really know, but it seems that possibly they're functioning, but at a very quiet level in the interior, and they're only maybe called upon, as we said in the quote right at the beginning, when the circumstances of life are rather extraordinary, when something happens that throws the body totally out of balance, when we're kind of knocked sideways, as it were, and we need to re-establish our symmetry. We need to actually almost come back to who we are. We need to come back to something very basic that we lose. So, in terms of working with these channels, it's a nice thing to think about, that when we don't feel that the 12 are quite enough for the job, we don't quite feel that it's an imbalance between the 12 that's going on here, if we feel that there's something a little bit more deeper, and of course some people would say that could be a developmental problem, or it could be something that we've inherited, or it could be something that goes back quite deeply. or it could be an extremely chronic problem that's kind of really taken away our ability to recover, and we need to draw on something a bit deeper. Those are the sort of ideas that people generally talk about as to why we would use these channels. And the other thing, this is again from the survey, it's not so particularly relevant here actually, but interesting that there's a kind of interesting connect with the triple heater said to carry some of this energy through the body. I'm not going to go into that now. Okay. I'd like to, we've got a quarter of an hour, and I would really like to kind of have some questions and have some ideas. Otherwise we could talk a little bit more about the certain points maybe that were mentioned, but I'd really like to see if you've got any thoughts and ideas, because we've just got another 15 minutes.
So can I say something?
I'll just do this one first, yeah.
I was just thinking about what you said earlier about, the Ren and the Do channel and balancing fundamental yin and yang and all of that. And ultimately, that's what we're always trying to do. So for me, there seems to almost be a case to identify and treat that first when somebody first comes to you. Is there any support for that in the literature or in your own clinical experience? Or
I don't think it's always so easy to access that instantly. I think sometimes it possibly is. And another interesting thing, and the thing that made me think about my Japanese teacher and that thing I said early on about the meditation, he said that Li Shijen suggested as the only way to treat the Ren and Du Mai is to do that kind of circulation of light meditation. So maybe we should get all our patients doing that. And in a way, that would be, for me, a fantastic way to begin that kind of balancing. I don't know whether that can be so easily achieved by needling. I'm sure it's possible, and I think if you get the diagnosis absolutely right, and it's the right point, and it's the right point in time, and for the person, that quite an extraordinary change can be possible, but. Yeah, it would have to be the right circumstances for that to be the case, but I think it's an interesting, I would say that that's what we're aiming for, and it's almost like that's what the whole of Taoist practice is about, and it's not that easy. So either you take quite a lot of time to do the work in yourself to create that balance. To create it for a patient instantly, I think you can certainly give them a taste of it. And when they've had that taste of it, they can kind of recognise what it is and then begin to see it in themselves. And I think treatment is incredibly good at that. I think treatment can very often awaken within someone, that's what it feels like, that's what it should be. And I really think that working on, for example, the Renmai and the Dumai can do that. And we don't have a lot of time, but it's another thing that was brought up quite a bit this morning, was whether you use the master couple points or whether you work on the channels. And I must say I'm getting very interested these days in working on the various points on the channels, and particularly those points that the points that we mentioned as we went along are really key. They were mentioned for very important reasons. So working with these 2 points, Dumai 16 and Ren 4 are very powerful points for regulating that system in a way. So I think there's lots of different ways. Just going to go here first. Thank you.
It was a comment. It occurred to me from the world of physics that another way of describing what's on the board might be a sort of memory resonance of the embryological state.
Yes. I think that's a really lovely term, because I kind of more and more see the meridians as carrying information, and it's like an information patterning system. And I think we carry information from a long way back, you know. And so I'm sure we carry the information of our inherited structure, you know, otherwise how would we grow into a human being from, that's what we do. You know, seeds contain all the information they need to grow, which is extraordinary, you know, which is why these things are called extraordinary. It's the other reason I really like using the word extraordinary. When I was training, we used to call them extras, which was always really annoying, but they really are extraordinary, and they remind you the fact that life is extraordinary, and that we can't try and put it into a box always, and we can't try and sort of understand it all scientifically and rationally, because it is quite extraordinary. But I think, you know, there's lots of ideas thankfully, in modern physics and in modern biophysics and biochemistry that are getting really interesting ideas about all of this. And if we could link up a bit, it would be, I think we'd have some good dialogues and some interesting language to use to describe what we're doing, actually, because I think we fall down often by not having the right language to describe what we do. Yeah.
Sandra, you were saying that these arose before the five-element system. I'm just playing with the idea, I'd like to know what you think. These are at the centre of the five-element system, and from these, the five-element system arose. So I've got a feeling there might be five-element points along the channels that you're saying you're playing with. Do you think that the five elements comes from these, and there are links?
The five elements is a way to describe something. These are all ways to describe something at different levels of development, you could say. And I think one of the most interesting studies is to think about where there are intersections with these channels and the main channels, and what's happening there. And that could certainly be that kind of thing, couldn't it? It's like stomach 30, which is, to me, I kind of think stomach 30 is an amazing point. I wish it was a bit easier to get at sometimes, but it's sort of, because it's on the stomach channel, it's doing all that nourishing, and it's to do with earth, and yet it's so totally linked with these meridians that are sort of have this pooling and pulling up and holding into this area as well. That I think if we look at those things, we'll begin to understand that a lot more. But of course, it's the same body. It's just we're describing it in different ways, and it's a bit like, it's like we're looking at a terrain, and we get different maps of the terrain. So you might have a geologist making a geology map, and you'll have a town planner making a slightly different kind of map, but it's the same territory. And what's interesting is to see, they put that city there because it's chalk, or they put that city there because there's a river. It's exactly the same. It's like we have to see the reasons for things, because our body is constantly described as a landscape in Chinese medicine. It's really interesting to see it like that. Hi.
Hi. Stephen mentioned pumping iron cords this morning in relation to the apex extraordinary channels.
She did.
Have you had any experience of those? Can you say a little bit more about those, or shed any light on them?
Should have asked Stephen that. I did learn how to do that with Stephen many years ago, and I'm not much of a gadget person, otherwise I might have followed it up. No, I think you'd have to ask him. The idea is that you literally connect. It's a very typically Japanese thing to do, because the Japanese are quite into polarities and magnets. Like the teacher I studied with is always using magnets on points with different polarities and things like that. So it's a bit like using a north and south pole magnet on something, and he would connect up. And the trouble is, I'm never very good at remembering which end I'm supposed to put where, so I sort of not good with gadgets. But literally you'd needle what would be called the master couple points of a channel, attach first to one and then to the other, and it had to be the right way around, and sometimes then you'd turn it around the other way on the other side. And there's in the sort of 2,000 years of history, there's endless things you can do with these channels, and particularly do with the master couple points. So that's one of those. But ask Stephen. It's fascinating, but I haven't got much experience of it. got 5 more minutes. What should we do for the last 5 minutes? Shall we quickly delve into a few points? You're familiar with these, which are the master couple points. Again, those of you who heard Stephen this morning, he was saying that this is a group of what were originally called the 8 influential points that came into being in the 13th century. And they were considered to be fantastic points for treating a lot of things. That's basically what they were kind of known as. It's almost like, we have these different groupings of points that are considered to be one particular physician's favourite points almost. This was sort of almost like one of those. And the other interesting thing, again, that Stephen mentions is that Lisa Jen, who wrote this massive tome on the 8 extraordinary channels, didn't mention the master couple points at all, which again is interesting. And the book that, I'm sorry I keep going on about what Stephen mentioned, but he talked about so much that I'm not wanting to also duplicate, but there's the book he mentioned, which is the translation of Lisa Jen, basically by Charles Chase and Nikki Shima, which is called I think it's just called the 8 Extraordinary Vessels, but it's a translation of the Qi Jing, Mai. Sometimes it's cow, sometimes it's gal. I've seen it spelt both ways, which is the treatise on the 8 extraordinary vessels. And in there's some really interesting treatments which are using points on the channels, points associated with the channels, to treat these particular pathologies and not using master couple at all. So I found that really, really fascinating. A sort of new area of study opened up. These are points I put down just as being really important points to remember. Of course, there could be lots of others, but these are the ones that we've mentioned, plus a couple of others put in maybe. So, and I mean, you're all incredibly familiar with these points, but Renmai 4, as the gateway to the origin, incredible importance in treating the yin, treating various kinds of fertility. And again, with the whole thing of fertility, it's really interesting with these channels because particularly the first 4, again, it's to do with the balance. It's not, okay, you use Renmai. If you've got a yin problem, you use Renmai. If you've got a yang problem, you don't use Renmai. But it's almost like the nourishing and nurturing aspect of things needs to come from the Renmai, and of course we know Renmai 4 is probably the best point for doing that. The nourishing, the holding, the being able to maintain a pregnancy, for example, would be so much to do with what the Renmai is capable of. It's that, and again, the ability to conceive, which is slightly different, is a little bit more a sort of yang function. It's the ability to get something started, to make something happen, to make that kind of union happen. And then there's the ability to nourish and to carry and to nurture as the pregnancy develops. So it's always about this sort of balance of both the movement and the ability to grow something. The Feng Fu point, of course, as we described, allowing clear yang energy into the brain. And that's what the Dumai is really all about. It's about lumbar problems, it's about shoulder problems, but most of all, it's about taking clear energy into the brain and allowing us to see, to think, to have clarity. Stomach 30 I've talked about quite a lot.
Excuse me, there are 2 kidney 6s with different names.
Oh, that's obviously a mistake. That should be kidney 9. Sorry, the bottom one's kidney 9. It's upside down. Gallbladder 26, Daimai, I kind of think of this point as being the way you adjust the tension of this girdle almost. It's like we've got this kind of girdle going around the middle and it's got to be not too tight and not too loose. And I almost think of gallbladder 26 here as, do we want to make it a bit tighter? Do we want to make it a bit looser? Do we need to sort of bring it in or out? And it's a really lovely way of thinking of that kind of... I always remember, it's one of the points that's can be used to help deliver the placenta in birth. And Daimai is very important in birth. It's one of those things that can be a really good channel to use to help birth. And gallbladder 26 particularly is often indicated to help deliver the placenta, which I've done once with extraordinarily good effect, I remember. And stunned everybody. So it just happened.
Could you say a little bit perhaps about how you might mix and match your use of the extraordinary channels? So that whereas we might obviously think Ren might do mine in partnership because of the circuit, but to use perhaps the do my another instrument, would you do that? Or stay with your
I tend not to mix them. I mean, I probably might not work on Ren and Do at the same time, partly because it's difficult. I might in one treatment, I could possibly use these 2 points, Ren 4 and Do 4 in one treatment. But it's possible. But I would say in using them together at the same time, I would almost treat that exclusive to be the yin and the yang chao. I would always use them together. I'd always be adjusting the two. And again, it's like the sort of loosening and the tightening of the left and the right and the up and the down and the day and the night. It's that adjusting of a cycle of a circuit. But the others, I tend to want to use them quite exclusively on their own. I often don't even, I mean, it's not that I wouldn't use points that were these points that are associated with other points, but then I wouldn't think so much that I'm working on that channel. I tend to want to be a bit exclusive because I think the information that you're giving through the needle needs to be very clear. And particularly with the extraordinary channels, I tend to use very few needles. If I were using a master couple point, I would just use the master couple point and points that I knew to be associated with that channel. That's me. Other people, do work in very different ways. And it's because I feel that the chi needs a clear message, particularly with these channels. So I would tend to be just doing that, just one at a time, apart from the Chow Mai.
And do you bilaterally, how do you think about...
We must stop in a second because it's gone full, but that's a sort of minefield. I can very quickly tell you what I do, which is to treat and I'll probably get it wrong because I'm a sort of left and right phobic person as well. I treat on the side of the male and female. I tend to treat, I don't treat bilaterally, I treat across the body. There's a reason for that, and there's a specific treatment that you can do, which is again something that's come down from someone sometime, which is like a crossing over that you do the yin and yang paired channels like the Ren Mai and the Yin Chow Mai at the same time. You'll do one first, and then you might use a point on the Ren Mai, for example. So you might open Ren Mai, or what we call opening Ren Mai, use a point on that channel, and then use Chow Mai, sort of on the opposite side. So you'd end up with bilateral needling, but you wouldn't do it bilaterally, if you know what I mean. So I tend to usually do it unilaterally, but crossed, if I'm working on master couples. Yeah, okay. But that would purely be using a master and a couple of one channel, unless you were doing that pairing of. Yeah, and I would stick with points that I know to have an association with that channel, just because it keeps a clear message. Okay, we ought to finish because it's nearly 4:05. Thank you.